I want to tell you one thing you were mentioning about this rabbi giving a class on Kabbalah. He asked me to come this week, give a Lag BaOmer class in the Old City. And he says, can you give it all about Reb Shimon Bar Yochai and Kabbalah? So I'm like, sure, well, what is Kabbalah? You know, because I remember the first time I ever came to Israel, 1974, I walked into a little grocery store in the middle of the day and I'm buying food. And the lady at the cash register, she says, I'll just say it in English, she says, would you like Kabbalah? Like, what? Here, middle of the day, you? It's like, you know. So, wow, Israel is like really cool. You know? Take a tomato juice, orange, and 2 Kabbalahs, please. You know. Oh, plus a Zohar. Don't get the Zohar. Right? Anyhow, it's definitely a wild country. And one of my wildest friends of all time, Reb Shimon, who he and I experienced the 1991 Gulf War. We were both in the same unit in the army together, which, you know, at one point, in the Israeli army, they say that there are two, well, there are probably more than two, but two very serious combat units. One are known as the Golanis, and one are known as the Gavatis, and we were all these religious guys known as the Gavaltis. So that was our special unit in the Israeli army. So anyhow, good to see you. So, yeah, so the class is all about, by the way, I have to just tell you, one of the real reasons I come here to teach is because I have no idea basically about the subject at all. And so therefore, by having to teach it, it like forces me to like, whoa, 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 you know, because there used to be the expression that necessity is the mother of invention. In New York, we shorten it simply, necessity is a mother. So when you have to deal with a situation, you've got to get the information, it puts the pressure on. And so hopefully, I hope that you'll enjoy what I stumbled upon going through a lot of this. But the idea of Pesach Sheni is really kind of obscure, and not many people, unless you happen to be awake in shul on Shabbat when they read it, and actually following it, you know, even know that there is such a thing called Pesach Sheni. And it's kind of an interesting concept, because I know, as the title put, it's like the idea of do-over, like we were talking about if you played street ball, as I did in New York, handball. So there was a certain thing, if you threw the ball the wrong way, it was automatically you got a do-over. But really, I mean, do-over is like such a bizarro concept. I used to have a recurring nightmare when I was younger. Probably shouldn't say this, so I'll just block this. But I used to have a recurring nightmare. I guess I thought I was watching too much James Bond movies, but they were taking me at gunpoint, and they were walking me, I guess, to be executed. And the gun was like behind me. And in the middle of this dream, I do this like kung fu, taekwondo, turn around, kick, to knock the gun out of his hand, and in slow-mo, here's the gun, like my foot misses. In my own dream, no less, right? My dream, you'd imagine, bam, was go on, boom, boom, knock him out. My own dream, that's like a real loser. I missed the gun. And then, of course, I turn around, I'm like, hey, I was just kidding, I would have given back the gun. You know, if you were me, you would have tried also, you can't blame me. And I don't know how, maybe because it was my dream, I got a second chance. And again, and again I missed, and then I woke up. But this idea of getting like a second chance in situations in your life, it's kind of a funny thing. How do you, not only, we're going to talk about this a little bit later when we go into the concept of linear time, but how, you really can't, I mean, unless you're Spielberg and you've got like Back to the Future, how do you go back in time and undo something? It's all linear, it's gone. You could improve, you can become better, you cannot repeat, but how do you actually get back there and fix it? And in a way, the secret is hidden in this kind of obscure holiday called Passover, the Second Passover. So what I'd like to do is, just in case you're not familiar with the text, and in fact, on a deeper reading of the text, it's going to reveal a lot of fascinating ideas and issues that come up. I'm going to take just a minute, I'll read through it, I'll translate it, it's not all that long, so don't get nervous. So it's actually, ironically, while there's the whole story of coming out of Egypt and Passover and so on is really in the book of Shemot, the story of Passover Sheni, the second Passover, is all the way later in the book of Bamidbar, in the, I forget how you call Bamidbar?
Numbers.
Numbers, right, numbers game. So Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe b'midbar Sinai, God says to Moses when they were in the desert, B'shana Hashenit, in the second year. So just to give you a little image of what's going on, the Hebrew month of Nisan is approaching for the second year, and this is the time of the inauguration of the tabernacle, of the Mishkan, and there's all kinds of celebrations. The tribes, each one are bringing up their offerings, and so on and so on. And as the holiday is coming, it says, from the time when they came out of Egypt, b'chodesh harishon, in the first month, which is Nisan, Lemor, God said, V'yasu b'nei Yisrael et Pesach b'mo'odo. Make the Passover offering in its proper time. Emphasis on the word in its proper time. In other words, all the holidays are in their proper time, but somehow there's an emphatic emphasis that specifically, as if we wouldn't know this and as if we wouldn't do it, but we would have anyhow, comes along and emphasizes bit mo'odo, in its time. But at the 14th day of the month of Nisan, towards the afternoon, Ta'aseh oso, you could probably notice I have the Ashkenazi Hebrew. So what can I do? Anyhow, my old-time teacher was Rashi. He kind of spoke like that, I guess. So you will do this. And again, b'mo'odo, it repeats a second time. In its time, you will perform this. So according to all of the laws that have been prescribed for this particular thing. So strangely enough, the word b'mo'odo, I'll just jump to the halakhic ramification of why the double language the Gemara explains. In its time, first of all, it comes to tell you that even on Shabbat, that the chidush, the novelty of the Passover offering, is that it could still be brought in the Mishkan or in the Beit HaMikdash, even on Shabbat, because, why is that a novelty? Because the Passover lamb is the offering of an individual, even though the entire nation collectively does it, and even though there were certain offerings that were on behalf of the entire nation, this nonetheless is called an individual offering, and individual offerings could not push off the prohibition against shechting, against slaughtering an animal on Shabbat. So in this case, it could. And the second language of B'modo is in halakhic ramification, ironically, is that if the majority of the Jewish people were in a state of impurity, because spiritual purity is a necessity to be allowed to participate in the offering of the Passover lamb, but if the majority of the nation was impure, ironically, then it was okay and everyone would still be allowed to do it in its proper time. So then it goes on, it says, Vaydaber Moshe el bnei Yisrael lasot haPesach, and Moshe gives this commandment. And in fact, this particular year, it was actually done on Shabbat. And not only was it done on Shabbat, it was the only time during the 40 years in the desert that the Passover lamb was actually sacrificed. So this was a very important moment in Am Yisrael's history, post coming out of Egypt. And so they went ahead and they did it, l'chodesh, on the proper day of the month, first of the month, in the proper time, etc., etc. And then there, all of a sudden, after that ends, comes along this. There were at that moment people who were spiritually had become blemished by having contact with the dead. In Judaism, we have certain hierarchy of spiritual impurity. And if you're not familiar with it, the basic thumb rule is that the intensity of impurity correlates to the potential of its positive nature. So therefore, you would have, for example, if a person came in contact with a dead rodent, that would be, let's call it maybe one of the lower levels of impurity. But then if you come to example of where a married woman is following her cycle and then she has her menstrual cycle, there, that level of impurity is because instead of becoming pregnant, the opportunity for life was lost. But the highest level of impurity is a dead human being, because there, this is life, this is a human being. And that which is the vessel that has the capability of bringing the greatest holiness into the world, suddenly its void creates the total opposite of the greatest level of negativity. So therefore, there were these individuals who, as the Gemara in Sukkah explains, actually asked the question as to what had happened. But one of the opinions is that it was what they call a meit mitzvah. In other words, somebody who was dead and there was nobody there who was able to bury him. In such a situation, that commandment is so holy to honor the dead that it circumcedes almost all other commandments, and therefore they had to be involved in the mitzvah, and they buried this person, but the contact made them impure. And therefore, we were not able to join with the Jewish nation to perform the normal Passover. Moshe and their case, and they were brought before Moses and before Aaron on that day. And they said, we are impure. Why? Because we did a mitzvah, and the commentators point out there's a rule in Judaism that the merit of a commandment's fulfillment is another commandment. Goodness leads to goodness, and negativity leads to negativity. So why should the reward for our having done a commandment of burying a person who needed to be buried be a punishment? We shouldn't be punished, we should be rewarded, or at least certainly not denied the opportunity to perform another commandment. So therefore, why should we be held back from bringing the offering of God? B'mo'odo, there's that word again, in its proper time, b'toch b'nei Israel, with the rest of the Jews. Vayomer alehem Moshe, imdu, stand here, v'yashma ma yitzava Hashem lechem. And I, Moshe, will go and find out what God says on the subject. I just want to do a little aside here for a minute, because this is too incredible to just kind of like la-di-da over this one little side point. But I always say to somebody, if you want to know my opinion, or as people like me, as opposed to real rabbis like to say, in my not at all humble opinion, we say that the 5 most important words in Judaism are, or in the Torah, are Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe le'mor. God said to Moses speaking, true or false. It's what it kind of boils down to. I mean, it's really what it boils down to. Did God communicate to Moshe, and did Moshe make this God's communication? That's like the hinchling for which everything rests upon. It's the critical 5 words. Actually, there's an even more amazing pasuk in the Torah, which actually uses this language. Vaydaber Moshe el Hashem le'mor. Only appears once in the Torah, which to me is extraordinary. But this is part of that extraordinary. I mean, you know, unfortunately, most of us, and I put myself at the head of the bad list, we have this feeling about God as like, buddy, yo, Hashem, like my friend over here, this is God, Shimon, recognize me, right? That's how we feel, you know, and we're doing like the shuckle thing, you know, like those little things you put in the back of your car that were like, right? So we're doing like the shuckle thing, and we're really feeling we're grooving with God, you know. It's very important, by the way, to notice that in the prayers, the language does not say that God answers prayers, just as he heard. He listened. I heard you. Okay, bye. Right? But he heard you. But so we have this closeness, which is really obnoxious, because it's very arrogant. It's really very arrogant. It's true that we are overwhelmed with God's love. It's true that each one of us is an imperative of creation, because God doesn't deal with excess. So that's all correct. But our reciprocation to God must be one of incredible humbleness. Yakov Avinu says, you make me small from the kindness that you pour upon me. That there's nothing that I am deserving. What of this is mine anyhow? None of it. It's all on loan, right? So therefore, when I have that feeling, I relate to God in that sense, my eyes open because my ego doesn't block the vision anymore. But of all of the prophets, to be able to be so confident in your relationship to Kodesh Baruch Hu, that this is probably the origin of Rak Rega, that Moshe could turn to these guys and say, hang out, let me just speak to the boss, and he's going to get the line, right? That's incredible. That's incredible. So, okay, now to our class. That's a little side point. Okay, back to our story. So he says to them, hang out and let's wait, and sure enough, Vaydaber Hashem el Moshe, there it is, those critical words, Daber ben Israel, say to them, Le'mor, ish, a person, ki yeh tameh l'nefesh, in fact, if he is spiritually impure, or he is a certain distance from, in this particular case, it would be the Mishkan, in the days of the temple, it would be Jerusalem. The Gemara Pesachim roughly nails it at about 15 miles away. I was trying to figure out, is that Modin? What's about 15 miles outside of Jerusalem? Beit Shemesh. Okay, right. So Beit Shemesh would be too far for that person to be qualified to bring. I mean, here you're coming from the Golan. I guess you would go to Beit Shemesh, come to the Golan. But let's say whatever that circle would work up to. And you get that far, but you're like still 15 miles away, And now, boop, that's it. You have to wait a whole nother month till you can bring your Korban. It's kind of a funny thing. I mean, especially today, you can cover that in like 10 minutes, or Shimon's driving 5, right? You can really cover that nothing. And yet, in those days, that was disqualification. Okay, but the point is, if a person's spiritually impure, and these are important points, because they're going to reveal a lot of things we're coming to, or if a person is a certain distance away, both of these things, in now or in future generations, such a person will be able to now bring the Korban Pesach on the 14th of the second month, which is the day that we've just concluded of ER, and therefore, and here's an interesting thing, it says, in Yasoto, he will make on that matzot umorim yachlu. He will eat the matzah and the morim together with the Pesach lamb. Now, hold that thought for just 1 minute. I want to introduce something, and we're going to come back to it a little bit later. Remember this? Wasn't that long ago? Passover Haggadah? Okay. So you guys probably remember, hope, you weren't, there's certain, I always thought if anybody here is like into audio, there would be a great little audio to make called Jewish audio. And it would be little sound bites of things that only Jews do. For example, you would set up a mic between a large group of people washing their hands, waiting for the motzi. Right? That's always an interesting time warp. Because, Jews, my gosh, to be quiet, and to be quiet between Natilas Yadayim and Hamotzi, right? It's really painful. Or you could do another one, which is really great, which is at the moment on Passover, when you finally get to the eating part, which I always think, if you really study, especially Gemara, and anything in Judaism, Gemara especially, you will discover that just like in our generation, we have like the Woody Allen, the Rodney Dangerfields. Well, guess who their great-great-grandparents were? These were like the great rabbis. So they had these awesome sense of humor. And part of this humor is they wrote this book, and they opened it up and they said, anybody who's hungry, come and eat. Oh, I'm starving, right? Well, you're not going to eat. 3 hours later, you're going to get to eat, right? Well, what happened to the, right? And then the original thing, well, at least can I have something to drink? And they misunderstood when he said, malishtot, he really said manishtana, right? But anyhow, so you're not going to get to eat, you're not going to get to drink, you're going to be just sitting there waiting. Now finally you get to eat. You wash your hands, and then there's that amazing sound of crunch, 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 crunch. Oh, everybody's now eating the matzah. How many people? I don't know, 20 people, 30 people. You go to a Chabad, 1,000 people in Nepal. They're sitting there. Nobody's talking. But for like a good, solid 5, 7, 10 minutes, there's nothing but crunch, 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 crunch. It's amazing. It's just kind of, anyhow, that's a little suggestion. Great little collections of Jewish sound clips. Of, you wouldn't get them anywhere else. But at that point of crunch, crunch, you come to Korach. You come to the famous sandwich. Kricha. And we know, and what does Hillel say? Zekel mikdash ki Hillel. It will be like the remembrance as Hillel did in the days of the temple. Kein asa Hillel. This is what Hillel used to do, Bizman Shebayit HaMikdash, because he was at the end of the time of the second temple. Haya Kayam, when it was standing. Haya Korak, he would wrap together the Pesach matzah umorer. And no, go for it. And what's that? Right. Right. Where's that pasuk from? Where's that pasuk from? I'll translate first. The verse he was quoting here, it says, because it says, on matzahs and morim, you will eat them. Guess what? This verse is from Pesach Sheni. The verse of Korach by Hillel is on Pesach Sheni. Why? There are no lack of verses going back to Shemot that talk about the commandment to eat the matzah. But all of a sudden, when it comes to the Korach with Hillel, talking about the time of the Beit HaMikdash, the reference is the verse right here. It's the verse right here where it says, "B'chodesh hasheni ba'abasar yom ben rabbaim yaso oso va'al hamatzot umorim yachluhu." That's what he's quoting. It's kind of an interesting thing, which we're going to get to because it opens up a lot of doors for us. But anyhow, that's the pretext, and that's the content as to what it eats. On a halakhic basis, the interesting thing about Pesach Sheni has no law of Yom Tov. There's no, a person can drive or whatever. You can watch MTV without a Shabbos clock. It's all fine. It's all permissible. And not only that, although at the moment of eating Korban Pesach you have to eat with Matzo, you can also after that have a hamburger with a bun, because there's no prohibition of Comets. You can have Comets, you can own Comets. So there's only this like one little thing that you have to eat the Korban, and you have to eat it according to Halakha of the Korban. You can't break the bones and all the other special laws that were unique to this particular offering. But that was where it begins, and that's where it ends. So the other question is a little strange to this. The Ramban introduces Sefer Bamidbar as saying that this particular book of the, how many books are there in the Bible?
24.
Ha! Right. Okay, that's the Bible. Good point. Of Moses' 5 books, right? Okay, actually there's 7, but we're going to get to that in a minute. So in the 5 books /7, I mean, like Jews are like totally crazy like this. Yeah, the 5 books of Moses, which are really 7. You got the Mishnah Baba Kama, the 4, which is really 2, and then there's the Mishnah in Shabbat 2, but it's really 4. And then we have the forefathers, which were only 3, right? So all these like strange numerical things that we deal with. So anyhow, you have the situation here where the Ramban says that the book on Midbar is going to talk about the events that occurred in the Midbar, and beginning with the beginning of the month of Nisan. So why is this particular thing, which is the 2nd month of that year, when they're now talking about the Midbar, why is this all the way at the very end? And he gives a simple answer, because since the previous book of Vayikra was talking all about the avodah, the service in the temple, it wanted to wrap that up, and now it begins with this particular, or a few stories, but all coming together towards that. Meaning, first it had to have a conclusion or a culmination of the Mishkan. The temple, if you will, had to be completely established in this world, both in terms of its features and in terms of the services that were going to happen with it. Because the Pesach, this offering of the Pesach, which again is a very unusual animal for multiple reasons. One, even though it's a national holiday, each one of us had to bring our own offerings. And 2, even though it was a holy offering, it was the only one that was allowed to be eaten outside of the jurisdiction where all other holy animals had to be eaten. And the answer here is because this represents national unity. This is about what makes us whole and makes us one. And the nature of being whole is not about being the same. Now, remember a million years ago, Mad Magazine had on the back of one of its covers, I remember, like, I wasn't a girl, I don't think, but, you know, today you don't know, but there was like, girls used to take a piece of paper, then fold them up, and then cut out a doll, and you'd open it up, and you're like, $20, all looked alike. So Mad Magazine had something that looked like a cutout like that, and it was a hippie kind of guy, I guess, with his bell bottoms and paisley shirt and Jufro, and he's holding this little thing, and it said, be an individual. So you're like 20 of the exact same guy, each one like be an individual. That's not called being an individual when you all look alike, think alike, and do alike, and your friends are only people who act and think like you. That's not really being an individual. The first time individuality and unity was expressed was at Shema Yisrael. Where did Shema Yisrael come from? You had Abraham to Isaac, you had Isaac to Jacob. It was 1 to 1 to 1. Now it's Jacob to 12. And he says, well, gosh, what's going to happen here? We're going to wind up with 12 different Judaisms. So all of the kids got together and they said, you're right. Even though we are very different, one Binyamin's not like Zvulun, Zvulun's not like Yissaschar, and so on, guess what? Shema Yisrael, meaning dad, we all believe in the same one God. And therefore, this is extremely important. That national unity in Judaism is not uniformity. It's not about all of us being the same. It's about the respect and understanding our common ground at the same time while maintaining our individuality, be it as shvatim, as tribes, or be it as individuals. And therefore, the animal or the event that represents national unity in Judaism is all of us coming together and yet each of us bringing our own offering. That is therefore the culmination of the Mishkan. Because the whole purpose of that is to show that as we understand our unity, that is what reveals the unity, if you will, of God in this world as well. So this comes along, and now all of a sudden, at the end of this event, we now have this Pesach Sheni coming, and it's coming in a certain way to tell us about something which is a very big chidush, and this is the chidush of tshuva. of the ideas we spoke about earlier, which we're going to go into a little bit now, linear time, and how do you go back, and how do you rectify? I mean, these guys blew it. I mean, people ask the question, what's the novelty of Pesach Sheni? You don't have it anywhere else, right? You don't have it on Yom Kippur. If you didn't fast, you get to fast on another day. You don't have a Rosh Hashanah. If you miss the shofar, you can hear the shofar like 30 days later, and it's still okay. Nowhere do we have something like this. And a person want to say, well, maybe it's unique to Passover because if it's an offering and so on. Well, not necessarily. I mean, these were individuals who innocently were unable to fulfill the mitzvah. So let's say you had somebody who was very sick. They were not allowed to fast on Yom Kippur. So they're also innocent, if you will. They should also have a right to redeem or rectify that absence in their life. Why specifically Passover? So some of our sages teach the following idea. That Passover is square one. Square one means, and this is why a convert to Judaism is also obligated in bringing the Passover offering. Because Passover is a time of taking the holy soul out of the deepest world of impurity, which is represented by Egypt. And therefore, if the soul doesn't have that ability to begin that process of elevating itself out of Egypt, then no matter what other spiritual activity it may do, it'll ultimately be like building a beautiful garden on a penthouse of a condemned building. If this foundation is not in place, everything else might be a spiritual buzz, might be feel-good Judaism, might be, yeah, I'm really into this stuff, but it's worthless. It's like pumping little bubbles on plastic bubble paper. It's a lot of fun, but does nothing. But if a person therefore has missed the opportunity to connect to the very root of their soul, then they have the ability to go back again and back again and back again and start again and start again. It's not just second chance. It's a chance all the time. And that's actually the power of tshuva. Now, how does this work? Because tshuva, the Gemara tells us, was created before creation, which, again, it's kind of like a Jewish brain, right? Well, how can it be created before creation? I mean, if you're saying it was created and it's before creation, well, wouldn't that be part of creation, right? But that's what you say, that tshuva was created before creation. How do we understand this? Okay, so we have a package called creation. Sun, planets, frogs, other things, right? That's creation. Now, before this platform, this OS, this operating system that we function in is happening, there were certain elements that were even pre this creation. Although created by God, they were still pre-creation. So the question then is, what does it mean that tshuva was created before creation? It means it's above and beyond time and space. Meaning, linear time is only something which is a human concept. Only as a human being do we have an idea of the word then. Then as referring to, you remember when that happened many years ago, when we then, or then like, I'll see you next week, then? Then is past and future. But there is no then by God. That's why one of the names of Hashem, the Yud K Vav K, is actually 3 words in Hebrew, was, is, and will be. Because by God, there is only capital N, now. There is no then. It's all now. Now, one way that I use to explain this is, if you think about the relationship of time and space, which is what we live in, right? When you drive your car, you go X miles per hour, so you are gauging time in terms of space, time and space. So you can use the same thing here. For example, if I ask Shimon, how far am I from you? You'd probably say 15, 20 feet. But you could also say 3 seconds. In other words, there is the time that Shimon would need to go from there to come up to here. Not just the distance that he would traverse, but the time that would be necessary to go forward. So therefore, in certain ways, let's say, for example, if you're looking at items on a table, and you pick up a cup on a table, and you move it to the other side of the table, you're not really thinking about, oh, I moved this cup into its future. I moved the cup from the right side of the table to the left side of the table. It's, in my mind, purely spatial, even though technically, yeah, I did move the cup into its future because I required time of this cup to be able to bring it to the next point. So by Kodesh Baruch Hu, by God, when there is all now, then there is no linear time, because everything is happening in the now. And therefore, if it's all happening in the now, the functions of things that occur are in terms of what they need to be rather than when they are. I'll give you a wild example. I think I might have used this in the last class, but I'll repeat it again. And that is, let's take a really kind of cool subject called reincarnation. Something I'm sure we're all very familiar with, might even gone through it a few times ourselves. You know, the Kutzker Rebbe always said, he says, after 120 years when you go upstairs, they're not going to offer you heaven. Don't even think about that. They're going to either offer you reincarnation or hell. And the Kutzker says, pray for hell with all your might. Don't come back. Like, finito. I always say, for those of you that maybe know me for more than a few years, and you'll know that I said, whoa, why should I die for my reincarnation? I'm just going to live through all my reincarnations in one lifetime. I'm going to go up there. No, did that. I'm out of here. Bye. But if you think about reincarnation, what's the normal fairy tale image of reincarnation? Guy's born, screws up, dies, comes back. Right? That's kind of like reincarnation 101. Well, yeah, but not necessarily linear. This person could have been born in, let's say, 1900, keep the numbers simple, dies in 1970, and now he's reincarnated in 16th century. Because God's not limited to linear time. So therefore, once God's not limited to linear time, then the idea of reincarnation is merely facilitating the needs of the soul's rectification to place it in an environment where it could learn the lessons that went unlearned in that previous life. So if you really want to get funky about that, that could very well be the next time you go into Shaarei Tzedek, into the maternity ward, into like all the little babies are, and there's baby A going, wah, 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 and next to him is baby B going, wah, wah. Baby B could be the reincarnation of a little baby A who hasn't even lived yet, because there's no linear time. So once you understand that there's no linear time, it's just merely that we get locked in on these frequencies. In the same way, if you want more on this, by the way, I suggest you read Rabbi Nachman's story, The Seven Beggars, about the blind beggars not blind at all, and the deaf beggars and deaf at all. Like, we think we hear, but we're locked within certain frequencies. We think we see, but we're locked within certain distances, and so on. So those things which we think are our sensual or our senses that we perceive the world with around us, these are really the very things that limit our perception. The fact that we see, we think we know what we're seeing, that's not at all what we're seeing. For example, let's take this. What color is this? Brown. All right? Right. Guess what? It's not. It's any color but brown. In fact, the one color that's not inside this wood is brown. So therefore, when the prism of light is hitting this, it's rejecting brown because there's no brown here. And therefore, that's why you're seeing brown, because that's the color that's going back. Right? So the very thing that you're looking at, and no one would hesitate to say it's brown, it's not brown. So that's a problem already in the way that we see things. How about the way we understand things? I sometimes deal with people that come along and they kind of have like very intense questions about the way God operates this world. I say, fine, let me just get a little background check here. You speak fluent Chinese? No? Okay. You speak fluent Hindi? No? Neither? Okay. How about Russian? Also not? Okay, so basically you don't speak the language of 2/3 of the world you live on. You don't even have that. So now what's your question? Like, where do we come with from our framework of what we understand, how we know what we are, to be able to perceive things? The only real way to do that is to actually remove ourselves from ourself. To allow ourselves, if you will, to go under the wave and to be humble and to understand the infinity of God's knowledge is not human intelligence times 100. It's a different spectrum altogether. So from the Kodesh Baruch Hu's perspective, everything is simultaneously happening. Nobody's ever died. Nobody in that sense has ever lived and died, because every moment is alive. Once you understand that every moment is actually alive, it's all in the now. So then, to use satellite as an analogy, when a person's doing tshuva, they actually have the ability, by connecting to the Ein Sof, by connecting to God, to what we would call go back in time. But it's really not going back in time. It's going into God's time. God's time being that which is the infinite. And once we connect to that moment in our linear lives, which we perceived as in that moment in time, it also simultaneously existed in infinite time. So what we're doing is we're connecting to the root of the limited time in its infinite moment and rectifying that. And that you can do at any moment in life. That's the power of tshuva. That's the power of Pesach Sheni. That's the power to tell us that everybody has the ability to go back to their very root. In this particular case, it's the root of the soul, going back to the purity of the soul. The purity of the soul is so pure that there is no death of the soul. We know that man, meaning human being, was not created to die. That was not the original game plan. And then all of a sudden, whatever happens, and now man brought death into this world. Although I once saw this totally blasphemous but very funny cartoon about what would happen if God comes down and he tells Adam and Eve, he says, listen, don't eat from that fruit, because if you do, you'll die. And Adam's like, okay, got it, not going to touch it, don't worry. Well, I said, oh, don't eat from the fruit, because if you do, you'll die. Yeah, I heard you. I'm not going to touch it, right? And so that's where the cartoon begins. So every time God comes back to visit Earth, there's zillions of people, because nobody ever died, because no one's going to touch the fruit. But anyhow, that's not what happened on our planet. So we wind up bringing death into this world. But death is just the ultimate illusion. Because how could there be death in the face of God? How could there be? How could there be anything negative? How could there be anything wrong? Even maybe we don't perceive it. But and at least allow our soul to think for a minute. How could there be death when God is all about life? So therefore, death is the clincher that enables us to believe in free will. Because since there's death, there might not be God. That's how our mind works. And therefore, I am now within the parameter of free will. Maybe yes, maybe no, maybe yes, maybe no. But really, ultimately, there's no death. And this is why Ani Mami Be'emunah Shlema, one of the most basic principles of Jewish faith, is that I believe in the resurrection of the dead. In fact, one of the wildest, in my opinion, one of the wildest Gemaras in Shas is some farmers are working in the field of Reb Kahana, and they're, working in the field, and all of a sudden one of them sticks a pitchfork in the ground, and a sound comes out of the dirt and says, ow! Like, woo, 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 and they go get the rabbi comes, and, they're like, right? And Rabbi comes over and says, hello, is there somebody in there? And yeah, guess what? There's a rabbi who was buried there 200 years ago. And so Reb Kahana says to him, he says, well, please, come on out. Would you like a cup of tea, a little sugar? Right? So the rabbi in the grave is like ranking out this rabbi. He says, you're a rabbi? You don't know the pasuk that says that we're not allowed to come out of the graves until so-and-so. I can't come out. Okay. So they start having this whole little conversation back and forth where the guy who's buried from 200 years ago can't believe he's talking to a rabbi. What, you don't know anything. But because why? Because we don't die. And so when you understand that you don't die, then you understand that the tumah, the impurity of contact with the dead, cannot be an obstacle to the soul's being able to revive itself. These people had contact with the dead, and they said, this is a myth. This cannot stop me from being part of my root in myself and my root with my people. Can't be. And Moshe confirmed, you're right, it can't be. Because the very word tumah in Hebrew is from the word atum, which means hidden. That really it's only light and hidden light. Darkness is hidden light. There's no entity called darkness. Impurity is not a reality of its own. It's only that which hides the higher levels of a Kodesh Baruch Hu's revelation in the world. Reb Nachman Kahana in the Old City once told me the following story. Rabbi Meir Balanes, who was also today's yard site, said that I could prove to you 150 reasons why a sheretz, why an impure animal is really pure. Say again?
Atum is really sealed.
Correct. Chidr atum, coming back to 1991. Right, sealed. Exactly. So I could prove on 150 levels that a sheretz is really pure. But what can I do? HaKadosh Baruch Hu, God, decreed that it's impure. So Reb Nachman asked the question, Jews don't pull random numbers. We might make crazy numbers, but not random numbers. So what's 150? And he answers like this. In the world of Pardes, on the 4 levels of every level of knowledge, each level has 50 levels of wisdom within it. So therefore, on the higher 3 levels, 3 times 50 is 150. So on the higher levels, the sheretz is not impure. It's merely on the level that we live in this world that the only reason it's impure is not because it's intrinsically impure, but rather Kodesh Baruch Hu, God, made a decree, called it impure. And thus I have to relate to it accordingly. But that's the whole idea. The whole idea is that really on the deeper levels, the purity is there in everything. Even though in this world that we have to live in, we have to live understanding what is pure and what is impure, because that's what is expected from us. I got into this very heavy philosophical debate with a Chassidish friend of mine. I always say there are 2 types of Jews. There are Chassidim and there's Hasidic. So I'm from the Hasidic camp and he's from the Chassidic camp. So when we communicate, and he started asking me, he says, come on, Gedaliah, you've learned a lot of Torah. You've even gone to the store and gotten Kabbalah, right? So do you really believe there's free will? Come on. Do you really believe there's free will? You've learned enough to know there's no such thing as free will. So he answered him as follows. I said, listen, I've learned enough to know that I am commanded by God to believe there's free will. So when you think about this, really what it means is there free will? I don't know. Maybe yes, maybe no. But it's insignificant. Because the Kodesh Baruch Hu, God demands of me that I live in a world as if there is free will. So therefore, is the sheretz intrinsically, is the rodent intrinsically impure? No, doesn't matter to me. I live in a world where my master, my creator, has told me to behave as if this thing is impure. But ultimately, impurity cannot stand in the realm of purity. That's one element. The second element is distance. The second thing here is, it suddenly says, right, because think about this. These gentlemen came along and they said, hey, we were impure. But nobody said anything about being too far away. So when Moshe comes to God and God comes back with the answer, where did this too far away thing come from? So it's very interesting. Sages tell us that the concept of the term far away actually just reminds me, I don't know if any of you are from New York, but I have a lot of friends who come from a religious area in New York which is called Far Rockaway. And when one of my really dear Amshinover buddies moved there, he said, yes, we've moved to dark far away. So the idea of being far, what does it mean to be far? So the simple idea of far is just that. It's far, right? Like, how do you know when to say Shema in the morning? It depends on the distance. It depends on the lighting. Can you recognize your friend? Can you see the difference between this and that? And I'm not going to go into teaching Gemara and Brachot, but all these are very deep analogies and metaphors about consciousness. Do you have the heightened consciousness that what you think is far is just merely you haven't come to understand what it is yet? And once you understand what it is, it's now time you can now say Shema Yisrael because you found unity in what otherwise you thought was you and other. But the idea of far comes into a deeper play. It says that when Abraham came to offer Isaac, it says he saw the place from afar. And the sages say, who cares? Right? So what if he didn't? Let's say he didn't see the place from afar. Oh, that's it. Whole thing's off. I didn't see it from afar. Right? Seeing from afar, not seeing from afar, has nothing to do with the mitzvah on hand. It's not going to be what we call in Hebrew ma'akev. It's not like if you didn't see it from afar, that's it, you blew it, go back to square one. No. And if it's nothing to do with the fulfillment of the commandment, why is it in there? Like a little creative writing? That's not the Torah. So who cares if he could or could not see from afar? So the sages explain a very deep idea here. That when a person is in a state of what's called far, it means that they are in a state of helim, which is they are hidden from God. Not that God is hidden from them, but rather they have, so to speak, become hidden from God. And God, in order to elevate the mastery of what Abraham would accomplish, it wasn't that all of a sudden God was clearly present like he normally was with Abraham, and that gave him the strength and fortitude to go forward with this seemingly insane situation of sacrificing his son after a lifetime of preaching to the world, stop sacrificing your children. He was throwing his whole career out the window with this, let alone his only child that he waited for how many years? And yet God made it more difficult because God made it far. And once it was far, it gave Abraham the chance to become great. Because we know, people say, well, if there's God, let God do a miracle. We know if we lived in a world of perpetual miracles, which guess what, we actually do, but we become used to them, we forget that they're miracles, like breathing, eating, walking, those boring miracles, right? But we do live in miracles, but we forget about that. But someone says, make an unusual miracle and I'll believe in God. Well, you wouldn't believe in God, you would be a robot of God, because it would strip your dignity of a human being with your free will. But if you don't have those miracles and you work it out in both of those critical places, and you really come to believe in God, that's your honor. That's kol hakavod. That's the purpose of olam asiyah, as the Zohar refers to in this world, a world of opportunity and action. As the Zohar says, when a child is born in this world, it's like the birth of a new sun in the sky. But if you navigate your life correctly, when you go back, you could be a galaxy of light. That's up to you. It's what you want to choose with your opportunity. But the free will is because it wasn't obvious. That's why, according to the sages, when Mashiach comes, the value of mitzvahs fall through the floor. A mitzvah is a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah. It's the reality of life. It's actually the name of God. But we're not going to go into that tonight. But the mitzvot are the way that we live. It's reality. It's not a philosophical thing. It's reality. So how do the values go down? Because it's obvious. We become like robots. With Mashiach, with the third temple, all these things, it's obvious. It's obvious. That's our value as people are lost. This could be one answer to the Gemara in Sanhedrin when the sages say, I hope I'm not alive in that period of time. It's very difficult to think that the sages who loved every Jew and person in this world, even animals, think of how much Rebbe was punished with stomach pains because he turned one little animal back over to the butcher and didn't have mercy on this little animal. So Jews are supposed to have so much compassion on life, it would seem funny that they're going, I'm glad I'm not living in Israel when the Iranians show up with a nuke. It doesn't make sense that that's what they'd be saying. But it would be saying is, thank God I'm not in the time when the value of my commandments will be worthless. Because now I'm living with the Romans, baby. Everything is chaos, but I'm holding tight to my faith. That's mega points. So the purpose of the idea of distance, therefore, is to create within us that power to see through it. Afal pi, even though ani mami b'emunah shleima, that afal pi, Mashiach doesn't come, I still have the emunah that he will and continue to go forward. So this is the second barrier. The first one is the illusion of death and impurity. Pesach Sheni, it overcomes that. It shows us the power of tshuva. We can break out of our linear time and always connect to infinite time. The second one is the idea of distance. That when I am far from the place is a reference both to the Beit HaMikdash, which is called Makom. It's also a reference to the name of God. So therefore, when I am far from God, in those two situations, I have the ability to do tshuva. The Belzer Rebbe talked about this in a very beautiful way. The Gemara says, the Midrash says that the distance between religious and non-religious Jews is as far away as east to west. Right? Like that, it doesn't get any further than east to west. So he says, really? How far away is east to west? Well, if you're facing one way, just turn around. That's all it is. Just turn around. You went from east to west. It's that easy. So when a person feels far from God, how can you really be far from God? I remember going back to Esha Torah, I won't mention his name, but there was a particular student I had. Art Linkletter, when you're Rebbe, you hear the weirdest things from people. So this guy comes over to me and he says, I'm freaking out. Whoa, what's the matter? He said, I'm starting to really understand what these rabbis and the Torah and what the whole thing, this is like heavy. I cannot, God is like really, I'm not going to be able to hold God away that much longer. I'm like, dude, tap, oh, it's God. Right? I mean, what do you mean you can't hold God away? Where do you think you want? I mean, let's go back to square one. Where is God? There he is, Captain. I see him out there in quadrant 7. No, it's not like that. Where is God? Tickle, 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 tickle. Right? We're inside God. Right? God is everywhere. It's not like God's over there and we're over here. Okay, God, give me what you got. Right? That's not what's happening here. We are inside all creation, everything. We are the subset. We are immersed in God. Now, maybe there's a film that makes the opaque in order to create, which is highly misunderstood in Kabbalah, the tzimtzum, the idea that God contracts from a certain part of the universe, which is impossible. Because if God were to contract from a certain part of the universe, wouldn't be God anymore. Big, certainly wouldn't mess, but not God. So therefore, God creates the ultimate illusion. God creates the illusion as if there's a place where there is no God. Right? So God creates the illusion of a contraction. But there's no contraction, there's no removal. It's just the appearance, the illusion of the removal, in order to give us a shetach, to give us an area and a space in which we can live out our lives, hopefully accomplishing all that we can. So therefore, the idea of being far from God simply means that we're out of touch. There's no distance happening here. It's out of touch. When we get in touch with the fact that we are created in the image of God, we have all the software embedded in our initial birth that we will ever need to find complete happiness and fulfillment. Shleimut, shalom are all within us if we allow ourselves to be able to access that point. And that's the point that we're able to reach through the power of tshuva. That's the power that lies within the concept of Pesach Sheni. I want to just bring in a couple of more points here that I raised for the evening here. And that's like this. The idea of going back to square one. There's a verse that King Solomon says, which is, Sur me'ra va'osei tov. A person should turn from bad and do good. And normally the way that that is learned is a step one, step two. Step one, stop, just put down the gun and move away and no one's going to get hurt, right? That's step one. Step two is do good, right? So the Baal Shem Tov, however, learns it differently. He doesn't learn it step one, step two. He learns it's a question and an answer. How does a person turn from evil? By doing good. The Aseh Tov, the doing of the good, is the rectification of the Sur Me'ra. Because if a person is filling their life with doing good, just got, hey, sorry, Mr. Evil, just like, I have to hang out. I don't have to well, how about next Tuesday, right? You just don't have time because you're so busy doing good all the time. There's no time, if you will, for evil. That's the way that he begins to express it. Bendosa in the Gemara, which I'm sure all of you are familiar with, really a wild Gemara, there was a particular animal that was killing everybody. And it was a big problem. I don't know if you remember Monty Python, the Holy Grail. It's only a little rabbit, right? So there was this animal that was going, this is how I can tell who's a movie buffs who catch the references. I have to just tell you, time out. But I have my oldest boy turned 40. And so I can't figure out how that is. I'm only 35. But anyhow, my oldest boy turned 40. And I said to him, look, 40's big. Like, let's do something. What do you want to do? And I, of course, was hoping, you know what, Dad? Why don't we, because he works, why don't we both take off a couple days and go in the Beit Midrash and the Ymir Yeshiva and like steig through something and kudshim? He was like, yeah, let's go to Scotland and visit all the single malt distilleries. So the next thing I know, we're in Scotland. And we're like, we have this like Scottish guy. I don't know if you know the Scots. I certainly didn't really know the Scots till I was there and I started learning like little Scottish jokes. My favorite was Scottish guy is drinking his drum, I forgot what they call the cups. Anyway, he's drinking his single malt and a fly lands in his single malt. And he picks out the little fly and he's squeezing it. No, spit it back. So we're like driving around, and this guy, he didn't really actually look to see if we had horns, but he definitely never met Jews before. And it was he was wonderful, and he was really passive until we came to a place as we're driving, because he was also our guide, and there was a battle. And that's where we beat the British. And then it, continued it was like amazing, he lived this. So after a while, he kind of he says, look, I got something for you. And he took us to the castle where they shot the Holy Grail. I don't know if you remember the movie or not, the Monty Python. And when you buy your ticket, they actually give you 2 halves of a coconut so you can make the noise as you're like going around. Anyhow, it was a highlight in my life. Of course, not if we really had learned the Tosfos, but that was really kind of cool to make the... So this little animal's biting everybody and killing them, and Mendoza comes along and he puts his foot in the hole, and the animal bites him, and the animal dies. He takes the animal, and he turns it into like a little turban, and he goes into the yeshiva, and goes into the city, and he says, it's not the animal which kills, it's sin which kills. And since this man was kulo tov, since he was filled with holiness and was completely in touch with his being, which thus made him in touch with God, there was no room for death. So the death that the animal wanted to put into him had nowhere to go but back into the animal. So when we talk about this idea of understanding life, we have to understand it's not just that we're living now, but we have within ourselves something which goes beyond death. And that's the lesson also of Passover, to have the ability to become immortal. I mean, just think about this. We had this Shabbat, we had this very sweet Christian woman at our table. And she was really nice, but it's amazing. It's like it was the AM and FM, but whatever. And I had a whole bunch of yeshiva kind of Jewish guys at the table, and we're arguing over at what point is Kiddush on Friday night. Is it when the woman lights candles and she says good Shabbos, and therefore she's Yotzi Doraisa, and therefore it's a problem because if her husband hasn't, and he comes back, he's only making Kiddush the Rabbanan, and therefore how's he Yotzi? Because you can't be Yotzi if you're only Chayiv the Rabbanan, she's Chayiv Doraisa, but maybe when he says Vayichula, he's also Doraisa, therefore they're both the Rabbanan. And we're having this at the table. She says, yeah, I love that kind of Jewish talk. So it was like, and at one point, we're all having a very deep philosophical issue, and she starts, and she's so sincere, and she was so precious, and we loved her. But she's like, yeah, Jeremiah says that the Lord will, and we were like touched. Because, yeshiva guys, we don't, you never learn Tanakh if you certainly don't know the 24 books. If you ever ask a yeshiva guy, where's a verse found, he'll tell you, yeah, it's Gemara Gittin on Daf, right? So here you have this woman, she had this real love of Judaism and so on, and she had this awareness. And at one point she was saying, because what you're talking about here is you are continuing the dialogue from Mount Sinai. That's what's so amazing. I'm sitting here, and I'm looking at you, and you people are living God's word. And sometimes, it takes an outsider to make us aware of what we are. Remember once we had, I have a very dear pastor friend of mine from America, and he came years ago with some other of his church, and we invited them for Sukkah. Got the Sukkah all ready, it was nice and fun, and this and that. And when they walked around the corner, they jumped back. And they said, the home of the Lord. And it wasn't fake. It was real. They saw that. And it made me feel embarrassed. Why don't I see that? Because that's what it is. They really saw it. And it was very beautiful. And that's what brought it together. And that's what we have to realize. That the story of Passover, we're sitting here talking how many? 3,000 plus years? Every single year over and over again? Because the Vilna Gaon points out a very interesting question. In the middle of the Agada, I always forget the Hebrew. Because I have dyslexia, I thought, I'm going to beat it with Hebrew because it's going to go the other direction. It didn't help. Anyhow. I screwed that up as well. So anyhow, you have here the famous dipping of the pinky, according to some opinions, or the spilling of the cup, according to others. But there's the dipping of the finger, and you are reciting, if I can find it here, otherwise maybe someone can help me with the Hebrew. So you say Dam, right after that. What's it right after? It's Dam, Esh. Sorry? No, not Tzafardea. No. Oh, I got it. No, after that. It's, no, that's the Russian Tevod. Come on, guys, what is this? No, the three thing, here we go. Thank you. Bravo. Okay, show us all up, will you? So you have blood, fire, and date palm. Well, it doesn't say smoke. Asham is smoke, but it has date palm tree smoke. So the question is, first of all, what the heck is? Look, I've seen a lot of people smoke, but you never walk by a forest and the tree say, "Yo, man, guys, smoke." right? I never saw trees smoke. So what is this date palm tree smoke? So according to one opinion, it was trying to give vernacular to an image that had no word at that time and day. And so if you think about it, because I come from a heavy-duty Semper Fi United States Marine Corps family, so if you learn about the history of explosions, all explosions traditionally would explode as opposed to implode and then expand. The only one that really changed that, framework was the nuclear bomb, the atom bomb. So if you look at that and you don't have a word for it, you're going to see a column of smoke coming up and then sort of expanding. Well, that would be very much like a date palm tree where you have the long, long trunk and then you have this like that, except it's of smoke. Now the interesting thing is that pasuk, that verse which is being quoted in the middle of the Passover story is from the book of Joel. Hello? Book of Joel has nothing to do with the story of coming out of Egypt. What's going on here? What's the reference? I mean, a couple other references that had nothing to do with coming out of Egypt, such as the reference to Sennacherib, who was killed by the angel on the night of Passover. But what does this have to do with it? The book of Joel is only about the end of days. That's what it's all about. So why is it in the Haggadah? So the Vilna Gaon explains as follows. Because the story of the Haggadah is the book of life. It begins with the coming out of Egypt, but it ends with the culmination of the third Beit HaMikdash. And therefore, it's got within it every aspect. And therefore, when it says in the language of the Haggadah that each of us are incumbent to see ourselves as if we came out of Egypt, it doesn't mean you walk around like that, doing like the little Egypt shine type of thing. That's not what it means. Okay, everybody, you're going to close your eyes for 30 seconds and be there. I'm in Egypt, yay, I can see the whipping. Oh, look, there's a pyramid. That's not what it means. It means see the year 2018 and how is the unfolding process that began in Egypt happening in your generation, and how are you a part of it? Are you one who is moving that ball down the field? Are you somebody that's taking that and making it alive today so that it'll be alive tomorrow? Are you passing the baton? Are you part of that which has been going on? And therefore, when you become a part of it, you continue forever. And this idea of becoming a part of it is the secret of what I read before. The sages say a very unusual thing. Why were these gentlemen who became impure worthy? It might be a hard idea to understand if you don't have a Torah background, but bear with it. The idea is that everything happens according to one's merit. So therefore, to have God bring a divine commandment into the world through your merit is a huge thing. Huge. And thus, 90% or 99.9% of all of God's channeling into this world came through Moses. There were some exceptions of commandments that were given vis-a-vis Aaron, and even there it's argued that maybe still it was Moshe, but it said nonetheless to Aaron. But all of a sudden you have here the daughters of Tzlachad, through them, because of their holy righteousness of these women, the whole laws of inheritance came into the world. And now through them, through these people who don't even have names, all of a sudden comes into the world this amazing power of Pesach Sheni and the redemption of the power of Tshuva. So where were they so holy? I mean, okay, our sages tell us they're holy, full stop, they're holy. But is there a way to detect what their holiness might have been? And I want to suggest the answer is yes, and it's actually in the words itself. When they came and they said, listen to what they said. I'll repeat it again. Vayomra anashim ha'ema, these individuals, Alam anachnu tameim lenefesh adam, we have had contact with the dead and we are now impure. Lama nigra lebilti kriv es korban Hashem, why should we be held back from bringing the offering to God? That's where you could have put the period. That would have been a full sentence, and everything would have been covered. But the Torah doesn't end the verse there. It adds 4 more words. And the same word, which we emphasized before, which we're going to come back to, b'mo'odo, we should have been able to bring it in its proper time. And then it adds, b'toch b'nei Israel, to be inside with the Jewish people. In other words, long before John F. Kennedy, although if you remember when Oliver Stone came out with his movie JFK, in Israel. I love because people say, yeah, did you see the new movie Jafk? But anyhow, so long before John F. Kennedy, the Torah is teaching us, ask not what your nation can do for you, but what can you do for your nation? You know, a lot of people, unfortunately, come to this land and they complain about this and about that and how this is this. Let me tell you something. Come here when I came in 1974 and you think you're living in utopia compared to what it was then. Try to get a telephone in your house within 6 months of ordering it, right? You know, one of the ways you began to realize the power of God was you used to have phones with these little coins called asimonim, because you realized that the correlation between putting them in and getting a dial tone, there was no connection. It was all from God. If you got a dial tone, you had to make your hishtadlut, you had to put, you know, your coins, but that is not, right? So people come, but that's not what it's about. It's about, you know what can I do? Hello, I'm here, what can I do? What can I pick up? What can I be a part of? Garbage on the street? I'll get it, no problem. Not, oh, look, they litter. No, I got it. So that's their focus. This is what made them great. In life, there's always a balance in all nations in the world between the individual's right and society right. Just sit down and learn a little Baba Kama and you'll be able to really understand this. For example, I have my own piece of property. If I dig a hole in my property and somebody gets hurt in that property who was not invited into that property, I don't have to pay. I have the right to make a hole in my property. But if I dig that same hole in a public road, even though it's not my property, I say, hey, I don't have it's the public road. I don't even own the hole. But because I did it and somebody got damaged, I'm responsible for that. Why? It's the same hole, and not only that, it's not even my property, it's public property. The answer is because there's a harmony and there's a balance between the individual and society. There's a point where, yes, you have your freedoms, yes, you have your rights, but they become subservient to the greater collective need of society. And this is the beauty of law, is to understand the harmony between what allows the individual that expression of freedom, at the same time to maintain a healthy society to be able to move things forward. I want to take a very controversial step here, which you'll edit out later, please. And I'm not passing, God forbid, any judgment about any human being in this world, because as my Rebbe always taught me, there's only one judge, and it's not me, it's God. But I would like to raise a little interesting thing because it's such a hot subject today, and it has to deal with homosexuality. It has to do with the Jewish understanding of homosexuality. And it's really an interesting thing, because in terms of an individual who may have homosexual desires, there's nothing wrong with that person. And I'll tell you why. The Zohar says, which believe it or not, is very contemporary thinking, but bear with me before you stone me. Well, I like to get stoned, but not by rocks. But if you have all of a sudden a person who is a male body, but their neshama is not male. The Zohar talks about this. Every human being has X part, I'll make a play on words, X part male and Y part female. Because if a man, let's say, had no female, he could not relate to a woman. And vice versa. If a woman had no male, she couldn't connect to a male. This is like the idea why it says that Yosef circumcised the Egyptians before Yakov came down because they had no holiness. So he gave them some holiness that they could then recognize, wow, the holiness of Yakov. But the prohibition, if you will, of homosexual activity is no different than a man having a sexual desire for another man's wife. Also prohibited, or a fetish, or what have you. In other words, is leukemia prohibited by the law? What violation? Somebody, God forbid, that's leukemia. What sin have they done? None. So therefore, God doesn't prohibit having leukemia. If God prohibits something, it doesn't mean that the desire isn't there. A desire could be there, but you have to control it. You have to understand, like we talked about by the rodent, that maybe on a higher levels, things are all fine and all okay within God's higher worlds, but the way that we have to act within this world, so we have to understand that we are a guest in this planet, and our lives are given to us as a gift by God. And therefore, no matter what an individual's desires are, and we pray that all individuals, some people have a desire to steal, some people have a desire to murder. Those are things that we can control, and therefore we are responsible for our actions. But even so, When you look at the Midrash Rabbah in Bereshis, if you want to have a look, it's on chapter 26:5. I'm not sure, close to that. You'll find in that area.
Mm-hmm.
It says that the thing which broke the camel's back and brought the flood was the legalization of same-sex marriage. In other words, it wasn't homosexuality. Because again, homosexuality, I mean, you know, people have desires and we have to control them. So one man desires another man, one desires a woman he's not allowed to have, one person desires an animal. Who knows? None of our business, really. It's between me and God. But when it becomes an infringement no longer on the individual, but on the society level, that now on a level of society, we're going to go ahead and justify and make something legal. It's affecting the society. The society can't absorb that. And that's what, if you will, was a breakdown of society. So this is a very important idea, to always be respectful of an individual, to always have sympathy and compassion and understanding for whatever person's Yetzer Hara is. And guess what? The bigger the Yetzer Hara, the greater the person. The greater, I mean, you probably know the Gemara of Abaye. You can't go 3 pages in Gemara without seeing the name of Abaye. And his Rebbe found him standing in the Beit Midrash crying. And the Rebbe said, "What are you crying?" And he told him the following story. "I was walking through the forest, and there was an unmarried man with an unmarried woman, and they were walking into the forest, which was yichud, like seclusion in an improper way. And I walked behind them the whole time, because in case they succumbed to their temptation, I would make and that would save them. And they never succumbed. I couldn't believe it. I couldn't have walked through that forest," he said. "I would have been all over her. But this guy didn't even touch her. What's with that?" And from there we learn that the greater the mensch, the person, the greater the Yetzer Hara. Because it's the same thing. So therefore, when an individual struggles with his or her Yetzer Hara, we have to have all the love and all the compassion that we possibly can. But the struggle between the individual and that of a society to then come along and say, eating pig is kosher, can't do that. Because that's not part of who we are, and that's not part of the light that we're supposed to be bringing into this world. And that's what they understood. Their point was not only did we want to be able to perform the commandment, but it was an imperative that we as individuals would join with society. That's what made them great. That was the insight that they had, that understood that nothing could return or stop, the return of somebody who wants to come back to their root point on that. I just want to touch upon one last point here, and that is the idea of the Omer, which is associated with the day of the Pesach Sheni. So the Omer, which is Pesach Sheni, is called the Chesed Shebahod. Chesed, loosely translated, is kindness. Some people translate it as pity, because if you break down the word, it's chas, which means to have pity, dalid, on the poor person. So the word chesed is doing kindness for the needy. That's the actual word chesed. Chas, dalid. And the word hod is often translated, although I saw Chabad had a brilliant translation, which I now will only use this one, but the classical translation is, let's say, splendor. But they translated hod as humility. And I don't want to go too much into why, but it's a very beautiful insight. And I think I'm going to show you a little bit, but not really drill too far in that direction. So hod, which is splendor / humility, is a very interesting thing. The sages explain it like one who polishes brass. That if you polish brass over and over and over again, there's a light that comes out from it. And this is the light of a person who has really worked on developing themselves. A person who, instead of spending all their time complaining and pointing the fingers at everybody else who's wrong, tuned that all out and looked at themselves and says, what can I do to be better? In fact, just the opposite. When they saw something wrong, they knew it had to be something about themselves which was wrong. Again, Baal Shem Tov, there was a story, he was walking, he saw somebody desecrating Shabbos. And he goes back and he looks at himself in the mirror and he screams at his image, Shabbos! Shabbos! Why? Because there had to be something wrong in him that allowed this to happen. Matter of fact, I'm just going to digress for one more minute, tell you a true story. In 19-something, that's what happened, he gets my age, right? 19-something, there was the first movie theater to open in Jerusalem on Shabbos, or Shabbat, or Sabbath, whatever. And demonstrations broke out. And people were going down to this movie theater, and they were screaming when the owner would come out, Shabbos, Shabbos! And we told our Rav, Mordechai Scheinberger, about what was going on. He says, oh, well, if I were organizing these demonstrations, I would do it totally differently. I said, really? What would you do, Rebbe? He said, I would take all of us, and we would go down there Friday night, and when we walked out, we would scream at the top of our lungs, Shabbos, Shabbos! What? Hello? What? That's what they're doing. No. Haha. They're screaming Shabbos. I would be screaming Shabbos. Oh, I got it. Okay. It's like, you guys remember the High Life magazine? Like, what's the difference between these two pictures? Right? So, what? He said, you don't understand. If you read the subtitle, when those people are yelling at him Shabbos, the subtitle would read, if I could, I'd kill you. When I yell Shabbos, my subtitle says, if you would, I'd like to invite you to my house for Shabbos because I love you. Because if you really knew what Shabbos was, you wouldn't have the theater open. But both of them are, if you will, screaming Shabbos. But what are they really saying in that expression? And which is a very important lesson for all of us. You know, if you want to give tochacha, if you look carefully at tochacha, you've got to make sure that the same pasuk tochacha, rebuke, is right there by that same verse of Yahavta l'recha kamocha. If you're not loving the person who you're arguing with, then that's bad news. But if you are, then you can really argue. And you see it all the time. I remember when I first became, well, I don't want to call myself Baal Tshuva. My Rebbe says I'm not a Baal Tshuva. I just went from shogeg to mazid. But the idea of, you know, before I became, I just upgraded. Before I didn't know what I was doing, now what I know, but I'm still doing wrong. Okay, what? So, but like before I did, I remember I walked into a Beit Midrash and opened the door. I'll never forget, the very first time I opened the door, 1974, and it was like, so much noise! Yeah, I expected to be like walking into the library. You could hear like a little pin drop across the room there. So much noise! How could you possibly sit here? Anyhow, after a few months, I'm into it, and I'm like, you know, arguing, putting my thumb in like the little pencil sharpener, because now I'm really able to, right? And we're like doing the whole thing. And there are these two guys on the other side of the Beit Midrash talking about cheap El Al flights to New York. And I go over to them, I say, Shimon, listen, you know, you're disturbing me. Could you step outside if you're going to talk about it? Go out there and talk. And then suddenly we started to laugh because their talking to each other was not at all on the volume of this room. But it was like the room's noise was music. And that was like, because it wasn't holy. It wasn't in that holy sound, and therefore it was irritating. It didn't sort of like fit into the vibe. Anyhow, so when a person therefore rather looks at themselves and see how can they grow and how can they develop, the individual who's the epitome of this is Aaron. Aaron the high priest, Aaron a Kohen, Aaron Moshe's brother. In fact, in the Kabbalah, the two thighs of the human being are correlated to Moshe as Netzach on one side, and Aaron as Hod on the other side. And the thigh in human anatomy is a very interesting part of the body, because the thigh, on the one hand, is that which enables a person to stand. On the other hand, the thigh is the power that enables mobility. So it's both stationary and mobility. It's the ability to stand, and it's the ability to move, which is what Judaism is. Halakha is halicha. It's the ability to maintain and to move simultaneously. And that aspect of Aaron was all about self-development. To the point when his two sons died, he was able, Vayidom Aaron, he was able to accept and to take it upon himself, to stand there in the face of this horrible tragedy and still be able to accept upon himself the yoke of heaven because of his humbleness. This was the same man who realized something we need to learn desperately in our generation, and that is, Shalom is greater than Emet. Peace is more important than truth. It's not about being right, it's about being at peace. And Aaron, therefore, would use lying, which is prohibited, in order to create peace. if a man and his wife were fighting, he would lie. Oh, she feels so bad. No, she doesn't. He feels so horrible. No, he doesn't. But he would say that, and then they would come back together. Partners would have a fight. I feels really lousy. No, he doesn't. Oh, I can't believe I talk like that to my partner. Yes, you can. But he lied, and they came back together. So therefore, Aaron was a person who became a Rodef Shalom. He wasn't merely one who went after peace. He vigorously pursued peace. It wasn't just about, peace. He went out and made peace happen. At the same time, he also understood service to God, avodah, in every aspect. And through those combinations of those two things, understanding that you talk about chumras, today, unfortunately, I remember Reb Bulman, Zichrono Bracha, he was at a supermarket in Muncie, and he couldn't believe what he saw. He saw two women in line with their shopping carts, and one woman was looking into the other woman's shopping cart and taking out products. Says, how can you buy this? You hold from this hechsher? How can you? What is this? And so, actually, I had one of my Rabbanim once said to me, he told me a story. He was in a restaurant that only had a rabbinut hechsher. And some of his students, wasn't me, but they saw him and said, Rebbe, how can you eat in this restaurant? It only has a rabbinut hechsher. He says, you know what? After 120 years, when they get up to this question, I'm going to go, we're up to these questions. But anyhow, so here it was here he was, this level of Aaron was one that he understood that peace was so important and self-development was so important that everything he did about himself was to look at a chumrah as something that makes me better. Not about what do you do, and if you don't keep that chumrah, I won't be your friend. I do my chumras because I want to build more muscles in my soul to be closer to God. And guess what? In the generation of people who really went to chumras, they hid their chumras. Ravina, massive name out of the Gemara, he said that there were certain things which were called the hanhaga, the behavior of rabbis. And the Gemara says he dafka didn't do it because he didn't want to be known as a rabbi. He wanted all that he did spiritually to be hidden. And then even in the last two generations in Europe, great tzaddikim who just walked off into the forest where no one would know who they were, to other communities because they wanted to hide their holiness. And there were a bunch who would pray every day they should never become famous. Because to them, that was the worst thing in the world, was to be famous. God forbid. I'm just a nothing. Of course, the joke about Slobodka, where 7 to 7:30 every day in the Beit Midrash, they would go, I'm nothing, I'm nothing, I'm nothing. And this new guy walks in, never been to yeshiva in his life before, pulls up a chair, hey, when in Slobodka, do like, I'm sorry, not Slobodka, in Navardik. When in Navardik, do like Navardik. And he starts saying, I'm nothing, I'm nothing. And after a few minutes, one of the older guys says, hey, look at this guy, walks in the door and bammo, he thinks he's a nothing. So, but the truth is, these people really believed in that. And therefore, what's a kula? What's a leniency? That's how you look at your friend. Just learn a little Kedushas Levi. When you see your friend doing something, bend over backwards to understand why it might really be even halachically okay. And if it's not halachically okay, then remember the Gemara that says a person does not sin unless there enters into him ruach shtus. Well, we have that even in American law. You plead insanity. So therefore, if the person's sinning, you can't find a halakhic understanding in the most possible bend over backwards, then okay, they were just crazy for the moment. Forgive them. That's the way we deal with kulas and chumras. Chumras alai, on me. Kulas are on you. That's how you build a society. And that builds the doorway of love. And that builds the path of unity. So therefore, this doorway of tshuva comes through Aaron. And it comes through the kahuna, because they have that ability to bring the kindness of God into the world through their devotion and service, their meticulous devotion and service, and their love of the nation at the same time. And here's the last thing, I'll wrap it up now. When I said before that there are really 7 books in the Torah, it wasn't my novel idea. It's not because I'm really that bad in math, although maybe. It's because the Gemara says it. The Gemara says there's 7 books in the Torah. So why does it call the 5 books of Moshe? Because I'll count with you what the 5 books are. I'll use the Hebrew, forgive me. There is Bereshit, there is Shmot, there is Vayikra, and then there is part of Bamidbar up until the floating Nun. And then there are a couple little verses, which every time we open this box, we actually read those verses. And then there's another little floating Nun. That's the 5th sorry, that's the 1, 2, I told you better math. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah, that's the 5th book. And then the 6th book is from the end of from there to the end of Bamidbar. And then the 7th book is Devarim. Why? What is that? Well, if you look carefully, you'll notice that those couple of verses with the floating nuns, right after it, the whole narrative goes zoom. All the bad news begins to happen. The Korach, the Meraglim, the thises, the Kvetchers, all of the things, right? This is all downhill. So that the original 5 books of Moses were supposed to have been right up to that section of the floating nun, and that's where it would have ended. What is nun? Nun is 50. Nun is the 50th gate of wisdom. And we noticed, and we know, that which we are right now, we are in the process of going from Pesach to Shavuot, counting out 49 levels, and hitting that 50th gate of wisdom. That 50th gate of Nun Shari Bina is the passageway to the infinite. And it leads us to a holiday called Shavuot. And there's a parallel on the other side of the year. Because, bless you, because how do we know that a person, bless you, how do we know that a person is obligated to eat the first meal of the sukkah in the sukkah? It doesn't say it in the Torah. We learn it from what's called the Gezer Shavah, from a bridge which is built between the number 15 and the number 15. That just like it's an obligation to eat the Passover Seder on the 15th of the month of Nisan, so too is an obligation to eat the first meal in the sukkah, bless you, in the sukkah on the 15th of the month of Tishrei. So there's some amazing connection going on between Pesach and Sukkah. Pesach culminates 50 days later in Shavuot. Sukkah culminates 8 days later in Simchat Torah. Shavuot is the time when we receive the Torah, and Simchat Torah is the day that we celebrate the Torah. Why, on the very day of receiving the Torah, do we just sit around like talk Torah all night long? And on the day that we celebrate the Torah, almost nobody's learning Torah. We're getting smashed, drunk, and party. It's party time. Well, what is this going on? And what is the correlation? There are 2 doors to the infinite. One is the number 50, and one is the number 8. The number 50 is a doorway to the infinite vis-a-vis space, by understanding every aspect of creation. There are 7 days of time. They correlate to the 7 positions of space: north, south, east, west, up and down, and center. Movement in time, as we said before, correlates to space, or rather, movement in space requires time. Non-movement in space requires a different type of time called Shabbat, non-movement. So therefore, if you have 7 aspects of space and 7 aspects of time, every aspect of creation will 7 times 7 equals 49. So when you transcend 49 and you come to the level Nun, you come to Nevuah, Nun Ba. You now come beyond time and space to the level of the infinite. That is the receiving of the Torah on Shavuot. The real receiving of the Torah, of course, was Yom Kippur, when Moshe comes down after his 3rd 40-day stint up on Mount Sinai with the 2nd Luchot, or according to Mel Brooks, 3, but whatever. He comes down, he gives over the Torah, and now we celebrate it on Simchat Torah. Why do we celebrate it like Motzi Yom Kippur? And why is it dafka at the end of Sukkot? Because the culmination of coming of our souls out of Tumah on Passover, which reaches the elevation through the entry to the infinite through the 50th gate of wisdom, is now the purification of our bodies by taking the physical world and saying, Ain, there is none but God. Even those things which are worthless and meaningless, we turn them into our skach, we make them into our lulav. Everything in the physical world has purpose, and no value in the world has any value like the value of God. So therefore, the Sukkot is a rectification of the physical world, but it can only be done after we first understand the rectification of the spiritual world. And that's why Sukkot leads to the 8th day, because the 8th day is that idea of, again, the entry into the infinite, the receiving of the Torah. It correlates at the same time to the idea of Shavuot, which is the expansion through time and space. And that is all this idea of Pesach, that when we create the opening of understanding, as the Gemara says, and then I'll tell you this, and we're going to stop. The Gemara says that, I'm not sure actually if it's a Gemara or if it's a Medrash based, I think it's a Medrash. What's that?
The Nun, Nevuah, and the Nefesh.
Oh, I could go a whole road down there. Moshe reaches to Har Nevuah. he gets the nun. Moshe now with nun is neshama, which is Mishnah. What does he do with the nun? He gives it to his student, Yeshua bin Nun, who now brings it from Har Sinai into Eretz Israel, which is the Geula. We won't go there now. Anyhow, so that idea of now I lost the final point. Okay, never mind, good night.
Shavuot, sorry.
Sorry?
You were talking about Shavuot and Pesach.
Yeah, now I'm sorry, I had the whole punchline.
I'm sorry.
No, chas v'shalom. I'm sorry. But I lost it. All right. Anyhow, that's it. Good
Thank
night.
you very much.
Bye. If there are any questions, I'm sure that Rabbi Aaron would be happy to answer.
Shabbat